Home is supposed to be a sanctuary, the one place where we feel safe and protected from the outside world. But sometimes, the walls that shelter us hide secrets far darker than we could ever imagine. The house on 13th Avenue in Columbus, Ohio, looked like any other rental property near the Ohio State University campus. It was late summer in 2013, and 10 college students had just signed their lease and moved in, excited to start the new semester. The place was typical for student housing, a bit run down with creaky floors and that lived-in feeling that comes with decades of undergraduate tenants passing through. But within days of settling in, something felt off. At first, it was small things. Cabinet doors in the kitchen would be standing open when they were certain they'd closed them. The oven door, too, left ajar with no explanation. Lights flickered on in rooms no one had entered. The power on the third floor would cut out with frustrating regularity, forcing someone to trek down to the basement to flip the circuit breaker. The students laughed it off, making jokes about ghosts haunting their new home. It became a running gag among them and their friends. The house was old, they reasoned. Old houses did weird things. But the joke started to feel less funny when Brett, one of the roommates, kept hearing noises coming from the basement. Not just the usual sounds of an aging house settling or pipes groaning, but deliberate noises. Movement. Sometimes, when he went down to reset the breaker, he'd pause at the bottom of the stairs, listening to sounds he couldn't quite identify coming from behind a locked door. The door itself was unremarkable, the kind that might lead to a utility closet or storage space. No one had a key for it, and honestly, no one had really thought much about it, until the sounds became impossible to ignore. The noises weren't subtle anymore. Dings and alarms, the kind you'd associate with electronics or appliances. Things that shouldn't be coming from a utility closet. Mark Hartman, another resident, later described it as hearing weird mechanical sounds, almost like someone was living back there, which seemed absurd. Who would be living in a locked utility closet in their rental house? The situation came to a head when the students finally called their landlord and demanded that someone investigate the locked door. They needed answers. When maintenance workers arrived and pried the door handle off, forcing it open, what they found inside stopped everyone cold. It wasn't a utility closet at all. Behind that door was a fully furnished bedroom, complete with framed photographs on makeshift shelves, textbooks stacked neatly, a television, clothes hanging from hooks, and clear evidence that someone had been living there. Not just staying there temporarily, but actually residing in this hidden space, comfortable and settled in. The students stood in shock, connecting the dots that had been right in front of them all along. The open cabinets, the mysterious sounds, the power issues, all of it suddenly made sense. Someone had been sharing their home without their knowledge or consent, living in their basement like a phantom roommate, accessing their living spaces, walking through their halls while they slept upstairs. The students left a note asking whoever had been living there to please call them. They needed to understand what was happening. To their surprise, a man contacted them shortly afterward. His name was Jeremy. He agreed to come by and collect his belongings, and that's when the full story emerged. Jeremy wasn't some sinister intruder or dangerous criminal. He was just another college student who'd found himself in desperate circumstances and made a very poor decision about how to handle them. It turned out that Jeremy's cousin had rented the house the previous year. When his cousin moved out, Jeremy somehow kept a copy of the keys. The property management company, North Step Realty, had failed to change the locks between tenants, a basic security measure that should have been standard procedure. The keys didn't even have "Do Not Duplicate" stamped on them, which meant copies could have been made by anyone over the years. The implications were staggering. As Hartman pointed out to reporters, there could literally be hundreds of people with keys to their house. Brett Muglin, one of the residents, actually encountered Jeremy face to face during the summer, before most of the roommates had moved in. He'd gone down to the basement and found a man standing there. When Brett asked if he lived on the first floor, Jeremy skirted around the question, saying something vague about wondering when he'd meet the new residents. Brett assumed he must be a neighbor and thought nothing more of it. Only later did he realize that the man in the basement had been their secret roommate all along, living behind that locked door, coming and going through a side entrance that none of them ever used. The situation could have been so much worse. 2 of the 10 roommates were young women, and none of the bedroom doors had locks. Jeremy had had complete access to the house, to their belongings, to their private spaces. He'd been there while they slept, while they showered, while they lived their daily lives completely unaware of his presence. Hartman later told reporters it could have potentially been a very scary situation, and he was absolutely right. The vulnerability they'd been living with for weeks without knowing it was chilling. In the end, Jeremy turned out to be, in Muglin's words, a nice enough guy who just wasn't supposed to be there. He moved his things out peacefully and disappeared from their lives. The students had the locks changed that same night, finally securing their home the way it should have been from the beginning. They sought legal advice from the university's legal services, though no updates ever emerged about whether they pursued any action against the property management company. The incident made national news, a bizarre story that captured public imagination precisely because it touched on something primal, that fear that we're not as alone as we think we are, that our homes aren't as secure as we need them to be. The house on 13th Avenue became briefly famous as the place where 10 students discovered they'd been living with an 11th, uninvited roommate who'd been hiding in plain sight all along. The following year, when new tenants moved in, they inherited the legend. The basement room where Jeremy had lived remained untouched, preserved exactly as it had been found, a creepy reminder of what had happened there. The new residents admitted they avoided going down there, and who could blame them? For all the joking about ghosts and hauntings, the truth had been far more unsettling. Because ghosts aren't real, but the violation of discovering someone has been secretly living in your home, watching you, existing in your private space without your knowledge or permission. That's the kind of horror that doesn't fade when the lights come on. On a tree-lined street in the town of Poughkeepsie, New York, there stood a modest house that neighbors had long regarded with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The man who lived there, JoAnn Nichols, was known throughout the neighborhood as odd. Not threatening exactly, but strange in ways that made people uncomfortable. He was a loner who would sit in his car reading the newspaper rather than go inside. Neighbors remembered seeing him drive around with a mannequin seated in the passenger seat, a detail so bizarre it stuck in people's memories for decades. He would stare off into space, detached and cold, someone who seemed to exist on a different plane from everyone around him. His house reflected his personality. The property at 720 Vassar Road was filled with 7 sheds packed floor to ceiling with debris and refuse. The modest home itself gradually became overwhelmed with clutter, the kind of hoarding that transforms a living space into something else entirely. Neighbors noticed, but kept their distance. James Nichols wasn't the kind of person you approached with offers of help or friendly conversation. He was, in the words of retired Detective Captain Charles Mittelstadt, seriously cold. Which is why, when James reported his wife JoAnn missing on December 21st, 1985, Detective Mittelstadt immediately knew something wasn't right. JoAnn Nichols was a 55-year-old first-grade teacher at Gayhead Elementary School in Hopewell Junction, well-liked and dependable. She'd had a hair appointment at a beauty salon that day, but she never showed up. Her husband claimed he'd noticed her absence and called it in, playing the role of concerned spouse. But Mittelstadt wasn't buying it. There was no doubt in his mind that James knew exactly where his wife was. The detective's suspicions only deepened as the investigation progressed. When police visited the house after JoAnn disappeared, her car was missing from the driveway. When they returned for a follow-up visit, the car had mysteriously reappeared. James claimed he'd found it at a shopping center parking lot and had it driven home. When pressed, he said he didn't know how it had gotten there. The car had been meticulously cleaned, washed and vacuumed to the point that any potential evidence had been eliminated. It was the behavior of someone covering their tracks, not someone genuinely confused about their wife's disappearance. Mittelstadt confronted James about the inconsistencies, about the strange behavior, about the overwhelming sense that he was hiding something. James Nichols looked at the detective with those cold, flat eyes and said, "If you don't have a warrant for my arrest, you can talk to my lawyer." That was the last time investigators were able to question him directly. He'd shut down, retreated behind legal protection, and there was nothing they could do without evidence. No body, no physical proof, just a missing woman and a husband who showed absolutely no emotional response to her disappearance. The case remained open, reviewed annually by police as required, but it had gone cold. JoAnn's son from a previous relationship had drowned 3 years before she vanished, and some investigators theorized she might have run away or committed suicide, unable to cope with her grief. Others, like Mittelstadt, never believed that for a second. He drove past the house on Vassar Road regularly over the years, and every single time, he wondered if JoAnn was in there, somewhere behind those walls of debris and hoarded junk. The thought haunted him, but he had nothing concrete to act on. James Nichols lived in that house for another 27 years, surrounded by his accumulations, existing in his own isolated world. In December 2012, concerned neighbors called police because they hadn't seen him in several days. Officers responded and found James dead in his home at age 82, having passed away from natural causes. He died alone, as cold in death as he'd been in life. When he passed, he left no family willing to claim his body or take control of his estate. The Dutchess County Department of Community and Family Services eventually buried him in an unmarked location, and that might have been the end of the James Nichols story, except someone had to deal with the house. With no relatives stepping forward, Dutchess County Commissioner of Finance Pamela Barrick was appointed temporary administrator of his estate. The house was a disaster, filled with decades of accumulated debris, personal items, and garbage. It needed to be cleaned out completely before it could be put on the market. In June 2013, 6 months after James's death, a contractor was hired to tackle the monumental task of clearing out the property. The work was unpleasant from the start. Hoarded homes often contain unimaginable amounts of stuff, years of someone's inability to throw anything away compacted into every available space. The contractor worked methodically through the house, removing load after load of junk. When he reached the basement, he encountered a false wall, a section that looked slightly different from the rest of the construction. Behind it was a sealed container, large enough to hold a body. Inside that container, wrapped in a plastic bag and sheet, was a skeleton. The bones were nearly complete, and on one hand, still circling the skeletal wrist, were rope bindings. The hands had been tied. A large section of the right side of the skull was missing, consistent with blunt force trauma. The contractor immediately called police. Dr. Carrie Reiber, the Dutchess County medical examiner, worked to identify the remains. There were no usable dental records initially. DNA testing from a tooth proved inconclusive when compared to a cousin, JoAnn's closest living blood relative. But eventually, through dental records that police had saved from the original missing persons investigation, the remains were positively identified as JoAnn Nichols, the first-grade teacher who'd vanished nearly 28 years earlier. The autopsy confirmed what investigators had suspected. She died from blunt force trauma to the head. Someone had struck her with enough force to cave in her skull, killing her almost instantly. The manner in which her body was concealed told its own story. She'd been placed intact into the container. Shortly after death, before decomposition had begun, the container was then sealed and hidden behind a false wall that James had constructed in the basement, buried among his hoarding, concealed by decades of accumulated junk. The plastic bin and false wall had been enough to mask the smell as her body decomposed, particularly in a house already filled with the odors of decay and neglect. For 27 years, JoAnn Nichols had been there, just as Detective Mittelstadt had suspected every time he drove past that house. Captain Paul Lecomte, speaking for the police department in 2013, stated what everyone already knew. It was now safe to say James Nichols was a suspect in this case. The only suspect, really. His cold demeanor after her disappearance, his refusal to cooperate with investigators, his manipulation of evidence with the car, the false wall in his basement, it all pointed to a man who'd murdered his wife and hidden her body so thoroughly that it took nearly 3 decades to find her. Neighbors weren't surprised. Walter Wiskita, who'd lived next to the Nichols for 16 years, said everybody kind of thought James was responsible, just based on his emotionless character and the condition of the house. Another neighbor, Patrick Vantine, reflected on how police probably hadn't looked in all the right areas during their initial investigation. They'd searched the house, sure, but who would think to check for false walls in a hoarder's basement? JoAnn had probably been there the whole time, hidden among the trash and debris, close enough that officers might have walked right past her during their searches. Bill Emy, a former restaurant manager who'd known the couple, remembered JoAnn as having that southern class, a sense of refinement. He definitely suspected James had some responsibility for her disappearance. Everyone who'd known them seemed to have understood, on some level, that something terrible had happened. The case remained officially open for further forensic examination, but everyone involved understood the truth. James Nichols had murdered his wife, possibly during an argument or in a moment of rage, had hidden her body behind a wall in his own basement, and then lived in that house with her remains for the rest of his life. He'd managed to get away with it, dying of natural causes before justice could catch up to him. The man was cold, Detective Mittelstadt had said all those years ago. Seriously cold. And he'd been absolutely right. In the Houston Heights neighborhood, a small blue bungalow stood as the last defiant holdout against encroaching development. It was 2015, and the modest 1930s homes that had characterized this area for generations were being demolished one by one, replaced by towering modern apartment complexes with sleek brick facades and soaring price tags. Mary Stuart Cerruti, a 61-year-old woman who lived alone with her 8 cats, refused to sell her property. She called her little blue house her castle, and she wasn't going anywhere. Mary had become something of a neighborhood fixture, known for her fierce independence and her devotion to the stray cats she cared for. She documented them extensively with her camera, giving them names like Slim, Sweetie, and Little Spot. She'd write notes on the backs of the photographs, creating a record of their lives and personalities. When developers approached her about selling, she turned them down flat. When a massive 360-unit apartment complex called Alexon Heights was proposed for the land surrounding her home, Mary did something uncharacteristic for someone who generally kept to herself. She attended Houston Planning Commission meetings to voice her opposition. Footage from a February 2013 meeting shows Mary speaking to the commission. She wore red-framed eyeglasses and spoke haltingly, struggling to move her jaw, a condition that would later help investigators identify her remains. She called the developers the bad guys, expressing her frustration with the noise, with seeing her gritty neighborhood paved over, with the taxes that would inevitably rise. But her protests weren't enough. The project was approved anyway, and construction began, literally surrounding her little castle with steel and concrete. Mary documented it all through photographs, writing bitter notes on the backs about how she hated the construction noise, how she watched her neighborhood being destroyed. The massive apartment building rose around her property like a fortress, dwarfing her small bungalow, a visual representation of the battle between old Houston and new development. The photos she left behind told the story of a woman watching her world being transformed against her will. In the summer of 2015, Mary's neighbors began to notice something was wrong. Her mail piled up in front of the house, uncollected for days. A window broke and wasn't repaired. The usually tidy property started to look neglected. When people tried to check on her, there was no response. A friend who'd been trying to reach Mary finally reported her missing in August, concerned after she'd stopped returning phone calls. The missing person flyer issued by Houston police stated that Mary had last been seen sometime between February and March of 2015, though the exact date was unclear. Nobody knew it at the time, but Mary was still in the house. She'd never left at all. An animal cruelty report was filed in June 2015, and the person who responded to that call noted that the ladder to the attic was pulled down. 6 of Mary's beloved cats were found dead inside the home, likely having died of starvation after their caretaker could no longer feed them. But somehow, nobody found Mary herself. The house was eventually foreclosed upon in November 2015, selling at auction for $261,000, and the new owner began renovations, installing a new roof, fresh windows, and updated interiors. In March 2017, nearly 2 years after Mary had last been seen alive, new tenants were moving into the renovated house. One of them climbed up into the attic with boxes, looking for storage space. When he glanced down at the floorboards, he noticed something strange. There was a gap where a board should have been. And when he looked more closely into that gap, peering down into the space between the walls, he saw what looked like a jumble of bones and fabric. The new tenants immediately called police. When investigators arrived and cut through the bathroom wall to access the space, they confirmed the worst. Trapped in the narrow cavity between 2 walls, wedged into a space barely wider than a dollar bill, were the skeletal remains of a human being. The bones were scattered and damaged, gnawed by animals over the years. Mixed in with the remains were fragments of clothing, deteriorated shoes, and a pair of red-framed eyeglasses. In the attic above, investigators found cat cages and a conspicuous gap in the floorboards, about 8 inches wide, directly above where the remains had been found. The identification process took months. Mary had no close living relatives, no parents or siblings or children who could provide DNA for comparison. Dental records couldn't be located. DNA extracted from a tooth and compared to Mary's cousin came back inconclusive. The Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences team, led by Dr. Sharon Derrick, had to use other methods. They carefully examined the skeletal structure, which matched that of a small white woman in her early 60s. The bones showed evidence of poor dental health, including a missing front tooth and a relatively new crown on a canine, details that matched what was known about Mary. But the final confirmation came down to 2 things: her jaw and her chin. Investigators obtained photographs of Mary, including one from the shop where she'd worked and the video from the 2013 Planning Commission meeting. When they compared the shape of the jaw and chin in these images to the actual bones, they found a match. The jaw was very square, the chin almost indented, distinctive features that were clearly visible in both the photographs and the skeletal remains. Additionally, in the Planning Commission video, forensic specialists noticed that Mary seemed to have difficulty moving her jaw, speaking with slow, effortful movements. When they examined the skeletal structure, they found abnormalities in the jaw that would have caused exactly that kind of restricted movement. The identification was officially announced in January 2018. The bones in the wall were definitively those of Mary Stuart Cerruti. But how had she ended up there? The working theory among investigators was both tragic and simple. At some point in early 2015, Mary had been in her attic, possibly checking on her cats in their cages or storing something. She'd stepped on a weak floorboard, one that gave way beneath her weight. The 8-inch gap between the boards was just wide enough for her frail body to slip through, and she'd fallen into the narrow space between the walls, becoming wedged in that tight cavity with no way to free herself. The positioning of the bones suggested she'd fallen face first, her body becoming lodged in an upright or semi-upright position in the space that measured maybe 1.5 feet wide at most. She would have been trapped in complete darkness, unable to move or escape, slowly dying of dehydration, or possibly from injuries sustained in the fall. Her cats, locked in their cages in the attic, would have eventually died as well, unable to access food or water with their caretaker trapped just feet away. The medical examiner ruled her cause of death as undetermined, but Detective Jason Fay closed the case as an accident. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs of trauma beyond what would be expected from a fall, no indication that anyone else had been involved. Some neighbors and internet commenters found it hard to believe that Mary could have fallen through such a narrow gap and become so completely stuck that she couldn't free herself, but forensic evidence supported the theory. Mary was extremely frail, small-framed and elderly, and the physics of how bodies can become wedged in tight spaces are well documented in similar cases. What makes the case particularly haunting is the proximity of potential help. The massive apartment building that Mary had fought against stood right next to her property. There were, as neighbor Roxanne Davis pointed out, a couple hundred pairs of eyes on her house at all times, looking down from those apartments. Everyone could see that she was alone, elderly, frail, and vulnerable. But no one saw her fall. No one heard her cries for help if she was able to make any. The house was foreclosed, cleaned out, renovated, and rented. And through all of that, no one found her. The contractors who did the renovation never repaired the broken attic floorboard. They left the cat cages in place. They worked around the evidence of what had happened without ever discovering the tragic truth trapped in the walls. For nearly 2 years, Mary's body remained hidden in the very home she'd refused to leave, the castle she'd defended so fiercely against development. In the end, neither the developers nor the city claimed her property. She died in her home, just as she might have wanted, though certainly not in the way she would have chosen. The little blue bungalow had kept its final, darkest secret until new tenants climbed into that attic and looked down into the gap in the floor, finally bringing Mary's lonely fate to light. It was May 5th, 1960, in the town of Rhyl, North Wales, when Leslie Harvey decided to do something nice for his mother. At 29 years old, Leslie had his own family now, a wife and young son, and they lived nearby in Pensarn, close to Abergele. But his childhood home at 35 West Kinmel Street needed work, and Leslie planned to clean and redecorate the place as a treat for his mother, Sarah Jane Harvey. She'd been living in that house for decades, taking in lodgers during and after World War II to make ends meet. Now she was 65, small and sweet-looking, the kind of grandmother figure who seemed incapable of anything sinister. Leslie had always been curious about the tall storage cupboard on the landing at the top of the stairs. It was nearly 7 feet high and just over a foot deep, extending from the floor all the way up to the loft vent. His mother had always told him it contained leftover items from former wartime tenants, things best left undisturbed. But on this particular day, as Leslie prepared to renovate, he decided to finally see what was inside. The cupboard door hadn't been opened in years. When Leslie pried it open and pulled away layers of old clothes, cobwebs, and dust, his hand encountered something that made him recoil in horror. There, beneath thick accumulations of debris, was a wizened human foot. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness of the cramped space, he realized he was looking at a complete human body, dried and mummified, crammed into the cupboard in a sitting position with legs bent and chin pressed into the right shoulder. Within hours, 35 West Kinmel Street was swarming with police, forensic scientists, pathologists, biologists, and the local coroner. What had started as a simple renovation project had turned into a potential murder investigation, and sweet little Sarah Jane Harvey suddenly found herself being questioned as a murder suspect. The discovery that her son had made in that cupboard was about to expose a secret she'd been keeping for exactly 20 years. The process of removing the body was gruesome and difficult. Suspended from a hook inside the cupboard was fly paper completely covered with the corpses of flies. Thick cobwebs with dead spiders clung to the interior walls. As forensic workers labored in that confined space with minimal light, clouds of choking dust filled the air. Generations of flies had devoured the facial features of the corpse, while moths had destroyed the hair and clothing. The body had essentially mummified, preserved by the unique conditions of the cupboard. The drafts created by the space running from floor to loft vent had produced perfect airflow for desiccation, drying out the body rather than allowing it to decompose normally. The body had been dead so long that it was stuck to the linoleum floor of the cupboard. Workers had to use a garden spade to pry it loose before the rigid, dried corpse could be removed and taken to the mortuary. Newspaper reports from the time described the scene in vivid detail, capturing public imagination and horrifying readers across the world. The mummy in the cupboard became an international story, the kind of macabre discovery that seems almost too bizarre to be real. Sarah Jane Harvey, questioned from her hospital bed at the nearby Royal Alexandra Hospital where she had been admitted, initially identified the body as Frances Alice Knight, a former tenant who'd rented a room from her during World War II. Mrs. Knight had been in her 60s, estranged from her dentist husband, who sent her a weekly allowance of £2. She was partially crippled and often complained of severe muscular pains. According to Sarah's story, one particularly bad night in 1940, Mrs. Knight's condition had worsened significantly. Sarah, unsure of what to do, went downstairs to make her tenant a cup of tea. When she returned, she claimed Mrs. Knight was already dead. But instead of reporting the death to authorities, Sarah had done something unthinkable. She dragged Mrs. Knight's body into the cupboard, locked the door, and left it there. Then, week after week, year after year, she collected Mrs. Knight's £2 allowance from the post office, forging signatures and essentially stealing from the dead woman's account. Over the course of 20 years, this amounted to £2,099, a substantial sum for the time. Sarah had been literally profiting from the corpse hidden in her cupboard. However, the forensic evidence told a different story than Sarah's claims. The body had to be immersed in a glycerine solution bath for 7 days before it was soft enough for internal autopsy examinations to be performed. When forensic specialists finally completed their analysis, they found a stocking tied around the neck of the corpse, along with marks consistent with strangulation. Mrs. Knight had not simply died of natural causes and been hidden out of panic or confusion. She had been murdered, strangled with a stocking, and deliberately concealed. The prosecution argued that Sarah Jane Harvey had gained legal permission to access Mrs. Knight's finances, and that immediately afterward, she'd killed her tenant to continue collecting that weekly allowance indefinitely. The strangulation evidence was compelling, the financial motive was clear, and the elaborate concealment suggested premeditation rather than panic. This wasn't a case of an elderly landlady discovering her tenant dead and making a terrible decision in the moment. This was murder, carefully planned and executed, followed by 20 years of fraud and deception. Throughout her trial, Sarah maintained her innocence regarding the murder, sticking to her story that Mrs. Knight had died naturally and that she'd only hidden the body to avoid trouble. But the physical evidence contradicted her at every turn. The case captivated the public, not just for its gruesome nature, but for the psychological questions it raised. How could someone live in a house with a corpse in a cupboard for 20 years? How could she walk past that door every single day, knowing what was inside? How could she continue to collect money using the identity of a woman whose dried corpse was moldering just feet away from where she slept? The legal proceedings eventually concluded, though records of the exact verdict and sentence have become somewhat obscured by time. What remains clear is the enduring fascination with the case, the mummy in the cupboard that has haunted Rill's collective memory for decades. Retired police officer Raymond Vaughn later described it as the most unusual case anyone, including pathologists and all the police, had ever encountered. The peculiar conditions that allowed for mummification, the length of time the body remained hidden, the brazen fraud, and the cold calculation required to live with such a secret made it truly extraordinary. 35 West Kinmel Street still stands today, and while from the outside it looks like any other home on that street, locals know its history. The house where a landlady kept her tenant's mummified body in a cupboard for 20 years collecting pension payments and going about her daily life as if nothing was wrong. The cupboard itself, that nearly 7-foot-tall space on the landing, remains a physical reminder of how ordinary homes can harbor the most extraordinary and disturbing secrets. Leslie Harvey never forgot the moment he opened that door, expecting to find old clothes or forgotten household items, and instead discovering a wizened foot beneath the cobwebs. In a single instant, his childhood home transformed from a place of memories into a crime scene, and his elderly mother changed from a sweet grandmother into a woman who'd gotten away with murder for 2 decades. If he hadn't decided to renovate that day, if he hadn't been curious about that locked cupboard, Frances Alice Knight might still be there, hidden in that narrow space, her death and disappearance forever unexplained. Throughout history, homeowners and renovators have stumbled upon hidden spaces that reveal the darkest capacities of human nature. These secret rooms and concealed compartments exist in the gaps between official records and public knowledge, waiting to be discovered by someone brave or unlucky enough to look in the right place. In Cleveland, Ohio, a real estate investor working on a foreclosed property found something that made him immediately call police. Behind a storage closet was a small hidden room, and inside that room were metal chains, a soiled mattress, and shackles bolted directly into the wall. The room had no ventilation and was completely soundproof, designed to trap and silence whoever was imprisoned there. Police suspected the house had been used for human trafficking, though the case remained unsolved. The house was later demolished, erased from the landscape, but not from the memories of those who saw what it contained. In Norway, a group of students rented a house and were told by the landlord that rumors suggested there might be a secret room somewhere in the property. Intrigued, they searched until they found a small hidden space in the attic. What they discovered wasn't treasure or forgotten heirlooms, but evidence of something far more sobering. The room appeared to have been used as a hiding place during World War II, likely by Jews fleeing Nazi persecution. There was an old map of Britain with supposedly safe locations marked on it, a lamp that would have served as a silent alarm when someone entered the attic, and a sign in Norwegian that roughly translated to, "If you have a bad stomach, you don't have access," possibly indicating that those hiding needed to be extremely quiet and couldn't risk the sounds of illness. The room was a testament to desperate survival, a space where people hid from genocide, listening for footsteps that might mean discovery and death. In Detroit, Michigan, a couple renovating a 1940s-era home found a series of hidden notes tucked behind bathroom tiles. One note read simply, "Don't trust the man in the basement." The couple initially thought it was a joke, perhaps left by previous renovators playing a prank. But as they continued their work, they found an old rusted meat hook and a sealed compartment that appeared to have been used to hide something or someone. The notes were never explained, and to this day, no one knows if they were fiction, a warning from someone who escaped something terrible, or evidence of a crime that was never discovered. In a house in Pennsylvania, a man repairing his mother's staircase discovered a secret compartment that had been constructed inside the structure itself. When he opened it, he found 60 pistols and ammunition from the 1930s, an arsenal that had been hidden there for decades. Oddly, mixed in with the weapons were 6 deep-sea fishing rods, an incongruous detail that raised more questions than it answered. Why were the guns hidden? Who had put them there? And what possible connection could firearms and fishing equipment have that would lead someone to conceal them together? A woman in Savannah, Georgia, made a discovery in her attic wall that would haunt her for the rest of her life. While doing renovation work, she found dozens of handmade cloth dolls, all carefully arranged and dated, spanning several decades. On the surface, it might seem like a touching collection, perhaps the work of someone who loved crafts. But something about the dolls was deeply unsettling. They all had X's sewn over their eyes, and many were wrapped in fabric that resembled burial shrouds. It wasn't clear if they were mourning dolls, meant to commemorate deaths, or something darker. The woman eventually burned them, unable to live in a house that contained such disturbing artifacts. In Paris in 2007, a couple doing renovation work in their apartment discovered a body walled up behind a false panel. Authorities identified the remains as Jean-Pierre Renaud, a worker who'd gone missing in the 1980s. The story that emerged was tragically simple. Jean-Pierre had gotten into an argument with a fellow laborer during the construction project. The other worker killed him in a rage and concealed the body inside the building site, sealing it behind new construction. For 27 years, residents lived in that building with no idea that a murder victim was entombed in their walls. No one noticed a smell during the initial stages of decomposition. No one suspected foul play, and Jean-Pierre's disappearance was simply another unsolved missing person case until renovators broke through that false wall decades later. In Los Angeles in 2007, a family was shocked to find a child's skeleton hidden behind their walls. The bones belonged to a 4-year-old boy named William, who'd gone missing decades earlier. His parents had reported him kidnapped, but suspicions had always fallen on his stepfather, a known abuser. Forensic testing confirmed the child had died from blunt force trauma, and evidence suggested the wall had been sealed shortly after his death. The family who found him had been living in the house with no idea that a murdered child was hidden in their structure, his tiny bones testimony to a crime that had finally come to light. In Hamburg, Germany, a contractor renovating a home stumbled upon a hidden storage space filled with Nazi propaganda, swastika flags, and a metal urn containing human ashes. Historians believed the room had been used by a Nazi official who was hiding evidence as Allied forces approached at the end of World War II. The ashes were likely those of cremated victims from concentration camps, smuggled and kept for reasons that remain disturbing and unclear. The home was eventually turned into a historical site, the hidden room preserved as a reminder of the horrors that some people go to extraordinary lengths to conceal. These discoveries share a common thread. Homes are meant to provide shelter and safety, but sometimes they become repositories for secrets that are never meant to be found. False walls, hidden compartments, and sealed rooms exist in the shadows of normal domestic life, waiting for someone to tear down the wrong section of drywall or look in the wrong closet. What they reveal can rewrite history, solve cold cases, or simply leave more questions than answers, mysteries that persist even after they're brought into the light. The phrase "stuck in a chimney" sounds almost comical, reminiscent of Santa Claus stories and children's cartoons. But the reality of people becoming trapped in chimneys is anything but amusing. It's a horror that plays out in slow motion, a death by inches in complete darkness, and it happens far more often than anyone would like to believe. In Brighton, United Kingdom, a homeowner decided to remove an old fireplace during renovations. When workers began dismantling the structure, they found something that made them stagger backward. Stuffed inside the chimney, knees tucked under the chin in a cramped fetal position, was a human mummy. Forensic experts dated the body back over 40 years. The remains were eventually identified as those of a burglar who'd gone missing in the 1970s. Investigators pieced together what must have happened. The man had attempted to break into the house by climbing down the chimney, a method that seems feasible until you're actually inside a chimney and realize how narrow and treacherous they are. He'd gotten stuck at some narrow point in the flue, unable to move up or down, and had died slowly in that confined space over the course of hours or even days. For more than 4 decades, his body remained there, desiccating in the drafty conditions until it was essentially mummified, completely unnoticed by the residents living below, using their fireplace without any idea what was trapped above them. The case isn't unique. In 2008 in Colorado Springs, 18-year-old Joshua Vernon Maddox went missing. His body was found 7 years later inside the chimney of an abandoned cabin about a mile from his parents' home. Building contractors made the discovery when they began pulling the structure apart. Joshua had apparently entered through the chimney, possibly seeking shelter or investigating the abandoned building, and had become wedged in the flue. He died there, trapped and alone, his body hidden until the building's demolition finally revealed his fate. In California, the cases have been even more numerous. Dr. Jacqueline Kodarak, a 49-year-old physician, died in a chimney in what police described as an attempt to force her way into her boyfriend's home. He'd left to avoid an argument, and she apparently tried to enter through the chimney, becoming trapped 2 feet above the fireplace opening. Her remains were later discovered by a house sitter who initially couldn't identify the smell or source of the odor that had begun permeating the home. In Fresno, California, a burglar attempting to enter a home via the chimney died in what might be the most horrifying variation of this scenario. The homeowner, unaware that anyone was in the chimney, lit a fire in the fireplace. When they heard screaming, they quickly extinguished the flames and called for help. Firefighters rushed to the scene and smashed the brick chimney open with sledgehammers, but the would-be burglar had already succumbed to smoke inhalation. The homeowner had unknowingly killed someone, a trauma that would be difficult to process or recover from. The physics of becoming stuck in a chimney are simple but terrifying. Most residential chimneys narrow as they rise, designed to create the draft necessary for proper ventilation of smoke. A person who enters from the top can descend to a certain point before the space becomes too narrow to continue. At that point, they're wedged in, unable to go down or back up. Arms become pinned at odd angles. Breathing becomes restricted by the pressure of brick and mortar against the chest. Panic sets in, which only makes the situation worse as struggling can wedge the body in even tighter. Death comes from a combination of factors: asphyxiation from the restricted chest cavity, making it impossible to breathe deeply, exhaustion, hypothermia if the conditions are cold, or hyperthermia if they're hot. The timeline can stretch for days. People trapped in chimneys have been known to call out for help for hours before their voices give out. The torment of being so close to rescue, yet completely inaccessible. Trapped in utter darkness in a space barely wider than your body, slowly dying while life continues just feet away, is a nightmare scenario that unfortunately plays out with grim regularity. What's perhaps most disturbing is how often these deaths go unnoticed for extended periods. The mummified burglar in Brighton was undiscovered for 40 years. A chimney is essentially a perfect hiding place, one of the last places people would think to look when someone goes missing, and by the time bodies are found, they're often reduced to skeletons or dried husks, their identities difficult to establish, and the circumstances of their deaths reduced to educated guesses based on physical evidence and context clues. The chimney becomes a tomb, a vertical coffin that preserves its terrible secret until someone, someday, decides to renovate or demolish, finally bringing the trapped victim back into the light. Beyond the bodies and the secret rooms, Holmes have yielded a catalog of disturbing discoveries that speak to human obsession, fear, and the strange ways people choose to mark their territory or hide their secrets. These findings might not involve death, but they reveal something unsettling about the previous occupants and the hidden lives lived within seemingly ordinary walls. A cleaning team in London was hired to perform what's known as death cleaning, clearing out a property after an elderly woman's passing. In one room, they found a large, beautifully decorated Christmas tree with tons of children's toys underneath, all carefully arranged and wrapped as if waiting for Christmas morning. The haunting part? The woman had no children. The room appeared to be a shrine to a family she'd never had, gifts for children who'd never existed, an annual ritual of decorating for celebrations that would never come. It was a glimpse into profound loneliness, a fantasy maintained in secret for what might have been years. Another death cleaning revealed an elderly man who was known for his conservative views and conventional appearance. His bedroom closet contained a display of high-heeled women's shoes that would make any shoe collector envious, all clearly large enough to have been worn by the man himself. This private collection, hidden from everyone who knew him, represented a secret identity he'd maintained his entire life, never able to express publicly, only in the privacy of his own home, behind closed doors. In Ossining, New York, a cleanup team working in the attic of a 200-year-old farmhouse found a collection of vintage prams, antique baby carriages from various eras. On initial inspection, the collection seemed like valuable antiques, but closer examination revealed that each pram contained a carefully swaddled, fully preserved corpse of a small animal. Dogs, cats, squirrels, and raccoons, more than 10 in total, had been lovingly prepared for burial in these tiny carriages, mummified by the attic conditions. The careful attention to their arrangement suggested ritual or obsession, a form of mourning that had extended to creating an attic mausoleum for beloved pets and even wild animals. In Rexburg, Idaho, a family bought what they thought was their dream home, only to begin hearing slithering noises in the walls shortly after moving in. When they removed sections of drywall to investigate, hundreds of garter snakes poured out. Exterminators discovered that the house had been built directly on top of a snake den, and no amount of sealing could stop the snakes from entering the structure through countless tiny openings. The house became known locally as the Snake House, and the family eventually abandoned it, unable to live with the constant invasion of reptiles emerging from every crack and crevice. A father and son renovating a house found green plastic army men, dozens and dozens of them, hanging by their necks from strings inside the walls. The miniature hangings were arranged throughout the house, discovered one by one as they removed old plaster. In the backyard, they found buried doll heads, just the heads, separated from their porcelain bodies and deliberately interred. The discoveries suggested either an extremely dark sense of humor on the part of previous residents or something more disturbing. A fascination with death and execution played out through children's toys. One particularly eerie find came from a homeowner who'd lived in an apartment for 4 years before discovering a creepy doll sitting on top of the window pane above the air conditioning unit. The window was high up and the resident was short, so they'd never had occasion to look up there before. The doll had apparently been positioned to stare down into the room, pointed directly at the bed for the entire time they'd lived there. The thought of being watched by this forgotten doll night after night was deeply unsettling, even though it was an inanimate object. In various homes across the country, people have found notes and messages left in walls by previous occupants or construction workers. Some are touching, time capsules meant to communicate across decades to future renovators. Others are disturbing, messages warning about the property, cryptic statements that raise more questions than they answer, or detailed accounts of events that may or may not be true. One renovation uncovered a murder confession from the late 1800s, written in detail and hidden inside a brick chimney. The confession was given to a historical society, a piece of evidence for a crime that occurred more than a century earlier, long past any possibility of justice. These discoveries, while perhaps less dramatic than finding bodies or secret rooms, reveal the complexity of domestic life. They show that every home contains layers of previous inhabitants, each leaving their mark in ways both visible and hidden. The woman who never had children but maintained a Christmas room. The conservative man with a secret closet full of women's shoes. The person who hung toy soldiers and buried doll heads. They all lived their lives in these spaces, carrying secrets that only emerged after they were gone, when new occupants tore down walls and opened long sealed spaces. What we discover in the hidden corners of homes tells us as much about human nature as any psychology textbook, revealing the strange ways people cope with loneliness, express hidden identities, or memorialize their lives in ways they never intended anyone to see. When we close our doors and draw our curtains, we believe we've created a private world, a space that belongs entirely to us. But the discoveries made in homes around the world remind us that every house has a history, layers of previous lives and secrets that accumulate behind walls and beneath floorboards. The students who found Jeremy living in their basement, the contractor who discovered JoAnn Nichols behind a false wall, the tenants who found Mary Cerruti's bones trapped between the walls of her own home, they all thought they were simply moving into a house, starting a renovation, or cleaning a property. Instead, they stumbled into mysteries that had been waiting in the darkness, sometimes for decades, to be brought into the light. The most disturbing aspect of these discoveries isn't just what was found, but the realization of how long these secrets remained hidden, how many people lived with or near these concealed horrors without ever knowing they were there. These stories remind us that the homes we inhabit are never entirely ours. They carry the weight of everyone who came before, and sometimes that weight is darker than we could ever imagine. If you found these stories as fascinating and unsettling as we did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We explore unexplained mysteries and true crime stories every week, diving deep into the cases that make us question what we think we know about the world around us. Thank you for listening, and sleep well if you can.